I wondered if you could just give us a bit more context about you. You mentioned that you have a business degree, which is interesting, and I think we could all see how that connects into your fascination with PR and public relations. But how do you kind of go on from after that? You said that's where it started, but how did you actually start? What did you start to make when you said you became an artist?
I was really lucky because I was growing up during a Thatcher era of the United Kingdom. You're kind of going through that now. It's quite interesting. And what that meant was that the economic policy at the time meant that the jobs market collapsed, which was brilliant if you were at university and running a record label that wasn't making any money, because when your mum and dad asked you why you didn't have a job when you left 5 years later, you had a really good excuse. Really, the origins of all of this was that I set up a company called Junk TV, which was a independent film production company making films on formats that no one on TV would ever show, like VHS or Hi8, because they were affordable. And because we ran a night every 2 weeks, and we knew what the room was like. The room was the same room every 2 weeks. And we knew that there was a pillar over there, there was a sofa over there. And so we were able to start making films whereby the characters would turn around and go, "You in the chair, shut up." Or "Look under your chair," and there'd be something underneath they would have to read out that would form part of the narrative. So just by the nature of having had the time to spend that 10,000 hours you need to spend to be good at something, and then having, being able to make work in an experimental way meant that it sort of became an income and became a career.
So when people are doing, lots of people in the room are doing a degree at the moment in a specific art form, one art form or another, how does that, your experience and education or self-education or do-it-yourself approach, how does that fit with disciplinary learning and learning one discipline really deeply? How do you think those two things sit together? Is there a need for disciplinary training?
Well, in actual fact, what happened was that we just made loads of work. Like, I think in 1998, when Junk TV was in its first year, we made 57 films, something like that. And they're all shot very quickly, written, shot, acted, super quick. The first ones are awful. By the end of that year, they're starting to get good. And so just by doing lots was good. But also, we kind of had to formally educate ourselves. We had to start reading books and finding out what, because we were doing things in unusual ways, and some of that was good and some of it wasn't good. Some of the things we were doing organically were the same as things people were doing when they were educated, but some of them weren't. And we did have to sort of formally educate ourselves, if you like, in a way, through books as well. So I think there's a place for both. I would say, like, I do guest lecture on some university courses, and I always say the thing is, right, really, because you can end up just doing your, your assignments, which might mean that you make, if you're on a film course, you might make 3 or 4 films a year, but actually you should be making 50. Like you should, because by the time you've hit a 50th, it doesn't matter who you are, you can be, the biggest dimwit in the world, and you're going to be like me, and you're going to be making a fairly decent movie. And if you've got a brain, you're probably going to be making something brilliant. And I think that literally making lots of work and experimenting and showing it to people is really critical. And showing it to people who aren't on your course, showing it to people who have paid money to come and see it, and who are going to beat you up if it's rubbish, is quite good. All these pressures. Those 58 films or whatever it was that we made in that first year, I saw every single film in front of an audience. And sometimes I would leave cringing and feeling terrible, and I wasn't going to make those mistakes again. And sometimes I'd leave feeling good, and I would take those little bits of practice which were good and worked well, and I'd incorporate it.
There is an issue, isn't there, with when things are within a frame and you want to tell a story, there is a kind of ethical edge to things. It's clear where the story ends and where real life begins.
Yeah.
And as we move forward, as we're exploring this new transmedia field, combined with immersion, we face the problem of presenting false realities, potentially.
Yeah, I'm trying not to think about it.
So I'd like you to think about it for a few minutes. How do we start going about that? How do we deal with the ethics of fictionalizing the world? Is there a problem or not?
Well, the world is fictionalized. The sort of areas of study that really radicalized my thought in the opposite direction to which it was supposed to was the study of economics, how banks work, public relations, and marketing. And it was because combined with all the other reading that I was doing for myself at the time, I realized that there was a massive manipulation going on. And that manipulation, Noam Chomsky quotes a figure that says that 40% of dollars in America are spent on public relations. And they really are trying to construct a world around you which you believe in fully, which is to the benefit of people that are going to receive your bucks or your vote or whatever it might be. That I have an ethical problem with. And so for myself, I guess I'm saying what I'm trying to do is, in a way, with the work that I'm making, is enable a critical analysis of that process. Or, like in the case of the New Ten Commandments, for example, what we were doing in that show, for example, was deconstructing morality and trying to show that it's morality is a human construct. We made it. It's not as black and white as we might like to think about it. Actually, what I found, and it is very affecting doing that show because it was a conversation essentially between me and the audience, is that the population are generally quite a long way ahead of the rhetoric that's in the media and so on and so forth, and definitely ahead of the rhetoric of moral rhetoric that's in things like soap operas, definitely ahead of the newspapers, which is interesting. Why are they sticking with this line? What's the, if you're paranoid, there's an element of control going on. If you're not paranoid, I tend to think that actually professionalism and the clumping together of groups that are fearful of stepping out of line keeps things from evolving, and what I want to do is shatter some of those things.
Well, that was a good answer. I'm glad I asked. I have another question about what happens to the artist and what the role of the artist is in putting these things together. It's really clear, the film director, what they do, what the cameraman does or camera person, what the actor does on the stage. But when your practice moves into laying a series of breadcrumbs in the world that may or may not be found, what happens when you as an artist maybe disappears somehow, or the ego of the artist disappears? Probably a good thing. And as a transmedia maker, you have to kind of almost hide yourself and hide your tracks in order for the audience member to discover them.
Yeah.
So is that a good thing? Is that a good change? Have you come across that? Have you dealt with that yourself?
I think what you're talking about is a good change, but I think in order to assess that, you need to go back to what is the role of the artist anyway. And I think it's very important because, like in my country, it's funded by the lottery. And the lottery pays for all of the artwork that goes on. And whether you like it or not, there is then a question to ask. Why are they paying for me to do what I do? And I had to think about that for myself. I didn't want to just ignore that and sweep it under the carpet and say, thanks very much, I'm having a nice life, I'm traveling around the world and having a wonderful time. I realized that one of the things that's happened to me is that I've worked as an artist since I left university, which was 25 years ago. And in all of that time, I've had one job. Whilst I was at university, I had to do one job where I was in industry working in marketing. Since that time, I've never had to speak the party line. I've never had to be professional and be able to say some things and not others. And I think the role of the artist, and the reason why it's very important, is because we're unshackled to any political, commercial outcome. There are areas of problem with that, but generally, as a principle, it is a role in society where we can respond to the world in a really honest way without worrying what our boss thinks. And I know because, for example, in the New Ten Commandments, we talk about professional and amateur. Professional, the origin of the word is to speak with someone else's tongue. It's a church term. It means that when you're asked a question, whether you like the war in Iraq or not, if you work for the American government, you're going to have the party line. That's really corrupting. That's the professional stance. The amateur stance, amateur comes from amor. It's to do something with or for love. And I think artists should be amateurs. I think they should speak really honestly. And in that sense, it doesn't matter then how they do it. It's about me not just thinking unshackled, but communicating that so that other people can critically analyze the world around them. If it's not doing that, then it's probably entertainment, craft, decorative arts, or something else. I don't really, I draw a distinction for myself. Art for me is that specific thing. It's almost a democratic, free-thinking role. And then it's worth money from the government.
And this is my last question, folks. So be thinking about yours.
Wow, where's he going?
How are you doing, Pat?
Try walking this way a bit. Somebody guide him, otherwise he's going to end up. Yeah. We don't want any.
we've got these new words: transmedia storytelling, narrative, going across medium narrative, all these fancy words. And I just wonder what you think about whether stories and narratives are the right words for the kind of artworks that you're making.
I think, to start with, narrative, I think, is the right word, and I'll tell you why. And that is, when you learn about script writing for film, what you learn is that every scrap, every element, every detail of your story needs to feed the subtext of the tale. Imagine a story is like in top-line narrative, A meets B, they fall in love, then they have a fight, and then they get back together, and then they get married, right? Let's say that's the narrative. But the subtext is always something else about humanity. Now, in a film narrative or in a theatre narrative, every scrap of detail and information feeds that subtext. I think the same can be said when you're making a transmedia narrative. If you make a piece of work, I don't think it always does with all things that call themselves transmedia. Because the origins of the word really come from that sort of manga world where they would have a cartoon on TV and then they'd release a comic and then they would release an action figure, for example. Well, the action figure doesn't really tell you anything new about the story. I think in pure narrative terms, what transmedia does is that you are telling a narrative, but you're fracturing it across several mediums so that you can unfold the narrative in different ways and maybe more fundamental and important ways. Because the medium also has to be important to the narrative.
And so just about the future, how do you think it might... just give us the prediction.
Okay,
look.
look.
It's like a nightmare question.
So I'm working at the moment on a new show, which is an Oculus piece funded by the government. We're combining Oculus Rift like this, but with another device on the front, which is Leap Motion. It tracks your hands so that you can be in a virtual environment, which is exactly the same as the real environment that's around you. So when I do that, the chair's there, and the Leap Motion can track my hands, so it's really there. Okay, so those kind of things are going to become more and more possible. At the moment, literally within the next month or two, there are 2 360-degree cameras that are coming out, which are going to be $400 US dollars. So the same price as a GoPro, you can film a 360-degree ball, which you can watch on your tablet like this. And these things are going to have a profound effect because I've watched some of these 360-degree bits of footage, and film is changed. The language of film is going to change. We're entering an exponential increase in technology, which means that I would be crazy to predict anything beyond the next year or two. But it's going to be interesting. That's all I'm willing to say.
Good. Well, we'll believe you then. Next, we have questions from the audience. And we have space for another victim on the Oculus Rift.
I'll have to just set that up. Well, yeah. Let me just see where it's at. That's fine. Okay, stick that on your head. And then hold on to the desk, I would. Are you going to have to put that over your bun there? Okay, you good? There's the desk. And it'll start in a second.
Great. So, yes, this is the wise thing to do. If you want to have a go on it, you do need to come to the front row. So someone's already there. Yes, please, your question.
Thanks, Simon. It's a fascinating talk. Just a question to pick up on partly what the person down here mentioned about IS. How important is it for you, if we're talking about these techniques essentially mimicking life, and life as a sort of set of overlaying fictions which you're drifting in and out of, how important is it for people to be aware that they're in a work or a piece of art?
It's a very good question. So in a particular case, which I'm not going to talk about because I would give something too much away, the idea is that the audience follow a trail not realizing they're still in the show, but the end of that trail reveals that it's in the show. And the point of that is to, in a powerful way, communicate that you've just gone through a narrative which I've created. You didn't realize that was happening, but this is what I did. And it actually mentions, I'm going to give this much away, the end of the show is about the Mohawk Valley Formula. And the Mohawk Valley Formula was a formula created in 1937 to break a strike and is the language of public relations. And essentially what the Mohawk Valley Formula is for is convincing lots of people that something is real that isn't. And so for me, I couldn't, with this particular show, I couldn't end it without revealing that it wasn't real.
But what about people who, I think, the question is interesting, because what if people don't get to the end?
Good question.
And what happens if you're left hanging? I'm only asking you these questions because I'm trying to deal with them myself in my own work. So I'd like the answers, please. It's, maybe it doesn't matter. But maybe it's not.
I think it depends on what you're saying, right?
And how
If you're
complete do
convincing
things have to
people
be?
that
You know?
Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, I think it matters. If you're convincing people that whatever it may be, and there's been so many examples, some of those things are really insidious, manipulative messages that are designed to rip you off or engineer your consent, to use the terminology of Edward Bernays from the 1930s. The idea of engineering the consent of a population to do terrible things like the invasion of Guatemala, then I think then it matters.
Thank you for being so diligent with the mic.
You talked about the train at the turn
Yeah.
of the century and how people freaked out when they saw that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've spent a little bit of time playing with Oculus Rift, and I went to a meetup in Melbourne where I found there were a bunch of kids who were just using their phones.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, fuck Oculus Rift, we just use it. Sorry, I shouldn't have sworn. They just use their phones. And it strikes me that what we take as being real and what it takes to put us to that next level of immersion is we very quickly adapt to that.
Yes, true.
Do you feel that that's a struggle in your work, that you're constantly having to work harder and harder to drag people into this alternative way of thinking?
Not really, because I'll tell you something, probably in 10 years' time I'll be doing something completely different. I don't think that any medium is sacred, and I think once they stop working, you move on to something else. And the truth is, I mean, it leads on to another point, and that is that traditionally, you would plump for theatre, or you would plump for film, or you'd be a musician, or whatever. Okay, the world has changed. A, all the technology is very accessible and cheap, and B, you can learn to do anything from picking locks to being a ninja on YouTube, okay? So there's no excuse anymore, really, to be one thing. You can combine everything up. You can do everything all at once in a transmedia way, or you can switch from being a filmmaker to a music maker like that within seconds. You can learn to program a computer and make a bit of software. Oops, hello. On the floor. Do you need help? No. Good.
So we'll go back over to this gentleman with a question here.
It's a very persuasive medium, the virtual reality.
Immediately I tried Oculus Rift, and I could feel my muscles reacting to something that wasn't real. I thought, shit, man, they're going to be advertising to my legs.
It's like the first time, you get a physiological response.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's up to us to really step up and arm ourselves against things and question the world in a very fundamental way.
Just a final, very practical question. I haven't actually attempted it, but have you done any sort of 360-degree filming? Is that 360-degree film?
I'm just about to start experimenting with that. There's two products. There's a project called Geoptic and another one called Geonaut, 360-degree cameras which are coming out, which are 2K resolution, and they're $399. They were locked in a legal battle, which delayed the release until now, and they're on pre-order and they'll be arriving soon.
Hello.
Hi. I was just wondering how you thought of your audiences, like what you believe their responsibility is in your work.
So I'll just repeat the question just in case everyone didn't hear. What do you believe... what do you believe your responsibility is to your audience, or what
the audience's responsibility is?
Yes,
in your
what
work?
is the audience's
You know,
responsibility?
The best show to talk about with regard to that, because it's the one, it's quite recent. Last year I did this show, The New 10 Commandments. I did 45 shows in London, Brighton, Bristol. And essentially what happens is a 90-minute discussion, a dialogue, much in the same way as we're having now, but on specific topics between me, my collaborator, Lee Work, and 10 audience members. And we hit on some very, very controversial, delicate subjects, and we're prodding. And what interested me about that was that I came out changed. And I came out surprised by the audience. And I think what needs to go, because I think it's a patriarchal hangover from another era, is the idea of the Salvador Dali presenting his paintings, and we're supposed to sort of sit and look at them, like this. I find a lot of work that's presented in that way boring, and I find that they're also patronizing. It's funny that begins with the same 4 letters. And so I think it's a dialogue and a discussion. And so one of the things you can do with transmedia narratives is enable a discussion between the artist and the audience that continues over a long period of time. In truth, one of the very first shows of the New 10 Commandments, there's a couple of audience members that are still talking to me on Twitter and Facebook, mainly Facebook, about some of those things and other things. And I think that's really great, because what I'd noticed before that was, actually here, I did a show called The Sound of the Wind in the Trees, which is, it proposes the question, how do we make sense of standing on a ball that's floating through space? You know, how do we make sense of this predicament? Audience members here often come to the stage and start talking to you afterwards. And I realized this was a really, possibly one of the best parts of the show, was continuing the discussion. I now think that that me and the audience are on an equal footing, and we're communicating, because, you know, our life experiences are different, and it's actually about talking.
Well, that is a very good place to end. People could contact you. People could follow your Twitter account.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are coming to a workshop which is taking place, Simon's leading, on Thursday, which, for those people in the room who are attending, is in the building on the other side of the square, black building where the restaurant Bok Choy Tang is, in the Fed Square boardroom. There are about 3 places left in this workshop. It takes place, it's free, 1:30 on Thursday till about 5. Please see me afterwards if you'd like to attend that. And you can also continue the discussion by going to watch the performance, which is going to start at 9 p.m. tonight. So maybe see you then. Would everyone join me now in thanking Simon Wilkinson for his time this evening?
Thank you very much.